The Texas sky had no edges, that was the first thing. Sky in every direction, so wide it felt like a judgment, so bright it left nowhere to hide. A woman sat inside a lurching stagecoach with her left hand bare where a ring used to be, and her right hand gripping a leather strap like it was the only honest thing left in the world. 11 days on the road, 11 days of dust and wooden seats, and a name written on a piece of paper in her coat pocket. A man's name, a stranger's name. The coach hit a rut. Outside, through the glass, a town appeared at the edge of nothing small, sun-bleached, barely holding on, and one man standing still in the shade, not moving toward her, not moving at all, just waiting. Her whole body went tight the way it had learned to go tight. Then his hands came up, slowly, palms out, empty. She had never had a man show her his hands first. The stagecoach hit a rut 3 miles outside Broken Spur, and Mae Dutton grabbed the leather strap above the window like it was the last solid thing in the world, which, at that particular moment, it was. 11 days. 11 days of dust and wooden bench seats engineered specifically to punish the human spine and landscape outside the window, that just kept going and going, without offering the eye anything to rest on. Georgia had hills. Rolling green hills that told you where you were, gave you edges, gave you the decency of a horizon you could actually locate. Texas just spread itself out like it had made a decision and dared you to argue with it. Mae pressed her forehead against the window glass, warm from the sun. The scrubland blurred past in shades of brown and pale gold, and she thought, not for the first time and certainly not for the last, what exactly have you done? She'd been asking herself that question every morning for 11 days. Standing over the wash basin in whatever boarding house she'd managed to afford the night before, looking at her reflection and delivering the same speech to the same woman who looked less convinced each time she heard it. You got out. You made the right choice. You're going somewhere. The woman in the mirror had the same eyes every morning, dark, tired. Asking the question Mae refused to answer out loud because answering it might make her turn around. What if he's worse? She knew almost nothing about Cal Reavis except what fit inside 3 letters. The first letter had been careful, formal in the way of a man who'd chosen every word twice, and wasn't entirely satisfied with any of them. He'd described his ranch in terms of acreage and cattle count, which told her he was practical and not given to exaggeration. He'd mentioned his wife had passed 3.5 years ago, stated it plainly. No performance of grief, no story designed to generate sympathy. Just a fact he included because he thought she deserved to have it before making any decisions. She'd written back because of that, not the acreage, not the cattle. The fact that he'd treated his dead wife's existence as information Mae was owed, rather than a tragedy he was deploying to make himself seem more appealing. The second letter had been warmer. Still careful, but warmer. He'd mentioned the cottonwood tree beside the house, and then seemed to think better of waxing poetic about it, and stopped himself mid-description. She'd found that endearing in a way she hadn't expected. The third letter had confirmed arrangements. Practical, clean. The kind of letter a man wrote when he'd already decided something and was simply communicating the logistics. Mae had read all 3 so many times the paper had gone soft along the fold lines. She looked at her left hand now, at the bare skin where a ring had been for approximately 6 weeks. Preston Holt had sent it as a token of the arrangement, a pearl set in gold, understated for a man of his means, which in retrospect told her something about how little he thought she merited even in the gesture of claiming her. She'd taken it off on the bank of the Savannah River, 3 hours after leaving her father's house, opened her fingers and let it fall. The sound it made hitting the water was almost nothing, a small sound for such a large decision. Her father had made considerably more noise when she'd told him she wouldn't do it. He'd called her ungrateful, hysterical, said she didn't understand what was at stake, what he'd already agreed to, what Preston Holt expected in exchange for clearing a debt that her father had spent 6 years constructing with the patience and devotion of a man who believed risk was for other people and consequences were a matter of negotiation. She'd said she wouldn't marry a man who'd already buried 2 wives under circumstances nobody had investigated, because investigating them would have been inconvenient for a man with Holt's connections. Her father had said the rumors were malicious gossip from people with too much time and too little gratitude for what men like Holt contributed to the community. Then he demonstrated his own feelings on the matter in a way that left her unable to fully open her left eye for 4 days. She'd packed that night. Not everything. just what mattered. Her mother's small watercolor of the Georgia hills rolled carefully inside a cylinder of brown paper. 3 dresses, practical ones, the kind that could survive travel and work. The money she'd been quietly saving for 2 years in an envelope, tucked behind a loose board beneath her bedroom window. And the letters from Cal Reavis, folded into the inner pocket of her traveling coat, like a destination she'd been building toward without fully admitting it. Dorothea Wills had been waiting on her front porch at 4 in the morning. Mae had not told Dorothea she was leaving. Dorothea had been their neighbor for 11 years. A widow of 60, who had watched Mae grow up through lace curtains with the specific attentiveness of someone who saw everything and said nothing until the right moment arrived. The carpetbag at Dorothea's feet already held food for the journey: cornbread wrapped in cloth, dried apples, a small wheel of hard cheese. She pressed a fold of bills into Mae's hand without a word. Then she held Mae's face in both palms for just a moment, the way Mae's mother used to hold it, and looked at her with the particular steadiness of a woman who has survived enough to recognize the difference between a girl running away and a girl running toward. Then Dorothea pointed toward the train station. Mae walked and didn't look back. That had been the last human kindness she'd encountered for 11 days. Until now, she supposed she was about to find out. The coach lurched to a stop. Through the dusty window, she could see a town that had the look of something recently set down on the prairie from a considerable height and still working out where everything went. Frame buildings with false fronts, a water trough, a barber shop with a striped post, a general store with barrels on the porch, a dog asleep in the shade of a hitching post who did not consider the arrival of the afternoon coach sufficient cause to revise his schedule, and one man. He was standing in the shadow of the general store's overhang before Mae consciously decided to look for him. Tall enough that the shade barely reached the brim of his hat. Dark hair beneath a brown hat worn to the color of good saddle leather. Shoulders built by years of actual labor rather than genetics. A scar ran along his jaw on the left side, not fresh, not recent, the kind of mark that had been there long enough to become simply part of the geography of his face. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there with the absolute stillness of a man who had learned that waiting and idling were different things entirely. Mae's heart did something it had no business doing at this particular moment. She told it to stop. It did not stop. Fletcher Cord, the driver, was a weathered man with the face of someone who'd catalogued every variety of human folly from a bench seat 6 feet off the ground and had achieved a professional equanimity about all of it. He opened the coach door and extended his hand, and Mae took it and stepped down onto the packed dirt of Broken Spur, Texas, which was approximately as solid as it looked and considerably hotter than anything had a right to be in the late afternoon of August. The sun hit her like a physical argument, and then the man across the street pushed off from the wall and started walking toward her. Mae's hand tightened on the handle of her carpetbag. Her whole body went still in that particular way she'd developed over the past year. The way that calculated angles and distances and available exit routes before her conscious mind had finished processing the situation. It was not a useful instinct to carry into ordinary life. She was aware of that. She had not yet figured out how to put it down. He stopped 10 feet away. Just stopped. Like he'd read something in the way she'd gone rigid that told him exactly what he needed to know, without a word being exchanged. His hands were visible. Both of them. He'd noticed her noticing, and he had made a deliberate choice about what she would see. Miss Dutton. His voice was lower than she'd expected, roughened at the edges like good leather that had been worked in weather. He cleared his throat once, not nervously, exactly, more like a man recalibrating. I'm Cal Reavis. She knew that. She'd been looking at him since the coach stopped, and she'd known who he was, because he was the only one standing there. But she nodded anyway because her voice had apparently made a decision she hadn't authorized. Up close, the scar along his jaw was older than she'd first thought. Whatever had made it had happened when he was younger, maybe much younger, and he'd carried it long enough that it had simply become part of him, the way certain things did when you stopped expecting them to go away. His eyes were gray, not the flat gray of an overcast sky, the gray of the sky right before a storm breaks when there's still light inside it. He was looking at her the way a person looked at something they wanted to understand, not something they wanted to own. She wasn't used to that distinction. Your trunk, he gestured toward where Fletcher was unloading luggage from the boot. I can get it. I'll get it. The words came out fast. Too fast, she heard the edge in them. Cal didn't flinch, didn't correct her. "I'll walk over with you then." Simple. An offer that had already adjusted itself to whatever she needed it to be before she'd had to ask. She walked toward Fletcher and the luggage with Cal following at a distance that felt somehow considered. She checked over her shoulder once. He'd given her precisely the amount of space that didn't feel like being followed. She didn't know how he'd known what that amount was. Fletcher handed down her small trunk, the same one she'd packed in the dark at 2 a.m, while her father slept and the house was quiet in the way houses were only quiet when something was wrong, and tipped his hat. "Safe travels, Miss Dutton. You made it all the way," said simply. Like it was a genuine accomplishment, because it was. Cal lifted the trunk with one hand like it weighed nothing and carried it to a buckboard wagon waiting at the hitching post. A solidly built rig with a roan gelding in the harness, ears swiveling at the sounds of the crowd dispersing around them. Cal set the trunk in the wagon bed with a care that surprised her. Not the brisk efficiency of a man moving cargo, more deliberate than that. Like he was placing something that mattered rather than hauling something that needed to get from one place to another. He lives alone. 3.5 years alone. And he still handles things like someone might be watching who he doesn't want to worry. His name is June. Cal was at the horse's head now, one hand easy on the gelding's neck. Not a particularly original name. I know. Mae walked to the horse's side because she needed something to look at that wasn't Cal Reavis and his disconcertingly steady gray eyes. June turned his big head and regarded her with the patience of an animal who had been around long enough to understand that most human dramas resolved themselves eventually if you waited them out. She raised her hand slowly and let him smell her fingers before she touched his cheek. He leaned into it. Something that had been wound tight for 11 days for considerably longer than that, if she was being honest, released a single degree. "I had a horse when I was young." She said it to June rather than to Cal. "Quarter horse, chestnut. I called her Sunday because that was the day my father brought her home, and I couldn't think of anything then better on short notice." "What happened to her?" The unwinding stopped. "My father sold her." She kept her voice even, the way she'd learned to keep it even. "When the debts started, he said horses were a luxury." Cal was quiet for a moment. "Then, there are 3 at the ranch. June, a bay mare named Sage, and the most contrary paint gelding in the history of Texas, who I call Flint on account of there being no point in pretending he's anything other than what he is. You can ride any of them whenever you want. That's not conditional on anything." She turned to look at him then. Really look, because "not conditional on anything" was carrying a great deal of weight in that sentence, and he'd said it with the bluntness of a man who meant every word at face value and assumed she'd be smart enough to hear them that way. "Let me help you up." Not a command, not quite a question. An offer sitting there available. She let him help her onto the bench seat. His hand on her elbow lasted exactly as long as it needed to, and then it was gone. He came around the other side and climbed up, and there was space between them on the bench seat that felt intentional in the best possible way. He released the brake and clicked to June, and they rolled out of Broken Spur heading west. For the first mile, neither of them said anything. The silence wasn't comfortable, exactly. But it wasn't the bad kind either. It wasn't the silence of a man working himself up to something. Mae had learned that particular silence intimately over the past year, its texture, its temperature, the specific quality of the air when it preceded something she'd learned to brace against. This was different. This was the silence of a man who genuinely didn't feel the need to fill space with sound, and was apparently content to wait until she did. She resented how steadying she found that. The prairie spread out on every side of the road, 2 ruts in the earth that someone had optimistically designated a road, and she was beginning to understand that flat was a physical experience in a way she hadn't anticipated. Something almost aggressive about so much unobstructed sky. The horizon just kept going. It didn't offer her eye anywhere to rest. "It's very large," she said. "Yes. I didn't expect it to feel so." She searched for the word. Empty was what she'd almost said. But that wasn't right either. She turned it over. "I think I mean open." Cal glanced at her from under his hat brim. Something shifted in his expression. "There's a difference." "There is." He looked back at the road. She tried again. "Your letters were very formal." "I know." No apology in it. No embarrassment either. "I had help with the letters. My neighbor Bill Cutter, he was a schoolmaster for 20 years before he came west and took up ranching. I told him what I wanted to say, and he put it in language that didn't make it obvious I'd stopped my education at 13. Why 13? Had to work. Ranch hand first, then cattle drives, then eventually enough put by to buy my own land. He kept his eyes on the ruts in the earth ahead of them. My reading is decent, my writing gets the job done, my spelling would make Bill weep. But the letter, the content was yours. Yes, the words were Bill's, the content was mine. A pause. I didn't see the point in being something I wasn't on paper and then showing up as something else in person. She looked at his profile, the strong line of it, the scar, the way he held the reins with no visible tension in his hands. Most men would have led with the acreage. I did lead with the acreage. After the part about your wife. He was quiet a moment. That seemed like the kind of thing you'd want to know going in, whether you were walking into someone's grief or someone's life. They're not the same thing. Mae looked at her hands in her lap, at the bare place where the pearl ring had been. This man right here, she'd prepared herself for disappointing. She'd been cataloging contingencies for 11 days lists in her head of what she would do if he turned out to be cold, if he turned out to be dismissive, if he turned out to be the kind of man who thought a woman who'd traveled several hundred miles had surrendered her right to an opinion about anything. She had not prepared herself for this. What was her name? Mae asked. Ada. The way people say the names of things they've made peace with. Fever. 3.5 years ago now. She'd been sick before and come through it. So when the second fever came, I thought, he stopped? I was wrong, I'm sorry, so am I. Simple and true, he didn't dress it up. She'd have had opinions about you. Good or bad? Both, probably. She had opinions about everything. It was one of her better qualities. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of where one would go if it decided to arrive. She'd have said you have good posture for someone who's spent 11 days on a stage. I do have good posture. It's one of the things my education gave me that turned out to be actually useful. What else did it give you? Mae looked out at the prairie, at the brown and gold and endless pale sky, piano, French literature, the correct way to address correspondence to persons of various social standings, a beat, none of which are proving particularly relevant. Can you ride? I used to. That'll come back faster than French literature. She almost smiled, felt it on her own face and wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. She turned it toward the window and let the hot wind at it. They rode on. Cal pointed out things as they passed, not to fill the silence, but because they were approaching his land and he seemed to want her to have bearings before she arrived. That ridge to the north meant rain coming in from the panhandle. The dry creek bed on the left ran clear in spring, deep enough to water the stock. The notch cut in the hills to the south marked the property line. Then they came over a low rise and the ranch appeared. Mae had told herself she had no expectations. She'd told herself that every boarding house morning for 11 days. She'd been lying to herself, it turned out, because the moment the ranch came into view, she felt something shift against whatever vague notion she'd assembled from books and half-overheard conversations at her father's dinner parties. She'd imagined without quite admitting she was imagining something that announced prosperity. A substantial house, perhaps. A porch with some architectural ambition. Something that said, this man has built something worth building. What she saw was a 2-room log house with a loft, solid and properly chinked, with the look of something that had been constructed to last rather than to impress. A barn that leaned 4 degrees from plumb but showed no signs of having any intention of falling. A chicken coop, a small pig pen with 2 enormous animals who were sleeping through the heat with the commitment of professionals. A corral where 2 horses stood in the afternoon shade, and Flint. The paint gelding was standing in the full sun in the center of the corral with no discernible reason for it. He was facing west with the expression of an animal who had made a philosophical decision and was not interested in discussing it with anyone. And the tree. The cottonwood stood beside the house like it had been there first, because it had been there first, had been there before the house, and before anyone thought to put a house there. Before the town had its name, enormous and old, its canopy spread over the entire north side of the house, and the roots went somewhere Mae couldn't see but felt must be extraordinary. Its leaves caught the late afternoon light and moved in the hot wind, and made a sound like water running over stones in the dark. Mae stared at it. How old is it? She hadn't meant to say it. Of all the things she might have commented on, of all the practical and reasonable first observations a person might make, the tree was not the obvious choice. And yet, older than anything else out here. Cal looked at it the way a man looked at something he'd seen 10,000 times and still found worth looking at. Previous owner said his grandfather remembered it being this size. That's all I know. It's the most beautiful thing I've seen in Texas. He nodded like she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. That's what Ada said. He helped her down from the wagon and carried her trunk inside while she stood in the yard and turned slowly, taking the measure of the place. The heat was considerable. The sky was enormous. In the corral, Flint shifted his weight in a way that suggested deep dissatisfaction with the general nature of reality. The chickens had opinions she could hear but not interpret. This was where she was. Cal came back out and held the door open. Come see the inside, then you decide. The interior was dim and cool after the glare outside. One main room serving as both kitchen and sitting space, a cast-iron stove, a table with 2 chairs that didn't match, a single armchair by the west window. Everything was clean, not company clean, not cleaned, because someone is coming clean, but the clean of a person who lived with their things and took care of them because those things were the only things they had. Cal pointed left. My room. He pointed right, opened the door, and stepped back so she could go in first. The room was small. A bed with a pine frame and a patchwork quilt that had once been vivid and was now a soft memory of colors. A chest of drawers, a washstand, a window that looked north toward the dry creek and the cottonwood, and on the inside of the door a lock. New. The hardware still bright, the metal still carrying that particular shine of something recently purchased and recently installed. Mae went still. She looked at it for a long moment, looked at the brightness of it against the older wood of the door, looked at the mechanism, the solid weight of it, the fact that it was real and functional and had been put there deliberately. Then she looked at Cal standing in the doorway, not coming in, both hands visible at his sides. I put it in 2 weeks ago. Direct. No preamble, no apology, just the fact and the reason sitting right next to each other. After your last letter confirmed you were coming, I figured you'd want your own room, and I figured you'd want a lock. He reached into his shirt pocket and set something on the chest of drawers, set it just inside the door, within reach, from where she was standing, without her having to move further into the room if she didn't want to. A small key. That's the only one, he said. He stepped back before she came to get it. I didn't make a copy. Mae walked to the chest of drawers and picked up the key. It was small and cold in her palm in a way that small cold things sometimes were carrying a temperature that didn't match the room, carrying some quality she couldn't name. She looked at it, then at the bright new lock on the door, then at Cal still standing in the hallway, not crossing into the room, both hands visible, making no move toward her, and she understood that this was a choice he was making and had been making since the moment she stepped off the coach. He was showing her where the line was by staying on his side of it. You could have just told me the room was mine, she said. Words are easy, no judgment in it. A statement of something he'd apparently learned. A lock is a fact. She looked up at him. Why are you being careful? The question came out before she'd considered whether to ask it. She heard herself say it, didn't take it back. Because you went rigid in town when I walked toward you. He said it quietly, factually. And because I've seen that before. He stopped. Then simply, not everything that looks like a difficult woman is a difficult woman. The room was very quiet. My father, Mae started, stopped, started again. He had a way of explaining things. I imagine he did. He explained them with his hands. Usually, Cal's jaw tightened. The gray eyes went still in a way that was not passivity, not close to passivity. It was the stillness of a man processing something strong and very deliberately not making it her problem to manage. The bruise, he said. Not a question, the last explanation. Mae looked at the key in her hand. I left that night. Good, quiet, but with a precision that made it feel like more than one syllable. I'm glad you left. She closed her fingers around the key. I'll show you the kitchen, he said. Nothing's off limits. If you're hungry, eat. You're tired, the room is yours, and if you want to leave tomorrow, I'll drive you back to the stage myself. You keep saying that, because I keep meaning it. She looked at him standing there in the doorway of the room he'd put a new lock on for a woman he'd met 3 hours ago, and she thought about Preston Holt and his smooth voice and his tailored suits and the pearl ring he'd sent like a property marker being planted in advance. And she thought about her father's explanations, and she thought about 11 days of dust and cheap boarding houses and stretching food money and counting Dorothea Will's bills one more time to make sure they'd last. And she thought, This is not what I prepared myself for, not even slightly. All right, she said. Show me the kitchen. The kitchen turned out to be the west quarter of the main room, organized with the ruthless practicality of a man who had cooked every meal alone for 3 years and had developed strong feelings about efficiency. He showed her where things were without hovering. Cast iron skillet on the hook above the stove. Beans in the ceramic crock on the second shelf. Cornmeal and salt and coffee in tins on the counter. Water from the well out back safe to drink, he said, tested by every rancher within 10 miles who shared the same aquifer. She helped him make supper. He hadn't asked her to. She'd started, because her hands needed something to do, and standing in the kitchen while he cooked alone felt wrong, in a way she couldn't have articulated if she'd tried. He adjusted to accommodate her without comment, passed her the spoon when she reached for it, moved the skillet when she needed the counter space. No one directed anyone. It just organized itself. They ate at the mismatched table. Beans and cornbread, plain and good. Mae ate more than she'd eaten at any single sitting in 2 weeks, and tried not to think too hard about what that said. You played piano. Cal had remembered that from the letters. You said you hadn't touched one in 4 years. My father sold it. She kept her voice level. She'd had a lot of practice keeping it level. When the first round of debts arrived, he said it was a luxury. A pause. He said the same thing about my horse. He kept the things that made him look prosperous. Sold the things that made me look like someone who mattered. Cal set his fork down, picked it up again. He was quiet for a moment in the working through way rather than the shutting down way. She was already learning the difference. What else did he keep? Mae looked at him, at the gray eyes that were watching her the way they'd watched her since the moment she stepped off the coach. It was like she was worth the effort of actually seeing. He kept me long enough to use me as currency. The word settled between them over the table and the beans and the 2 mismatched chairs. That's what I was to him in the end. A transaction. Something he could trade for the kind of debt relief that money alone couldn't arrange. Cal didn't look away from it. He looked at it directly and then at her and said, "You're not currency. You know that. I'm learning it." More honest than she'd intended. Some lessons take time to actually stick. They do, he said, like a man who knew this from his own particular experience and was not inclined to pretend otherwise. She helped clear the table. He washed and she dried, and outside the window the sun was going down over the Texas prairie in a cascade of orange and gold that seemed almost unreasonably generous, like the sky was compensating for the flatness by spending everything it had on the ending of every day. "There's water in the pitcher in your room," Cal said when they'd finished. "I'll refill it in the morning. The well runs quieter this time of year." "Thank you." She folded the dish towel and set it on the counter, turned to go to her room, stopped. There were things she couldn't say, not yet. Maybe not for a long time, about what the lock had meant when she'd seen it. About the particular rearrangement it had produced in something she hadn't known was disarranged. "Cal," he turned. She held the key up slightly, then lowered it. "Thank you." He nodded once, not like it was nothing, like he understood exactly what she meant, and was accepting it without requiring her to explain it further. "Sleep well, Miss Dutton." She went to her room and closed the door and turned the key in the lock and stood with her back against the door in the dark for a moment. The sound the lock made was nothing like dropping a pearl ring into the Savannah River. Quieter, more final, like closing a window that had been left open in a draft for too long. She unpacked her carpet bag because having her things arranged, however few they were, made a place feel less like a temporary situation. Her mother's watercolor went on the chest of drawers, Georgia hills in late summer, a little faded at the edges but still true. Her 3 dresses went on the hooks behind the door. The envelope of money went back into the pocket of the dress she'd keep hanging right side out. She sat on the edge of the bed. The quilt was soft in the way of things washed many times and earned softness. A softness that came from use rather than newness. Outside the north window she could see the top of the cottonwood in the last light. The leaves had gone silver as the dusk came on, moving in the faint night wind like something breathing. She lay down on top of the quilt, because it was still too warm for covers, and looked at the light finishing its business with the window and thought about where she was. Broken Spur, Texas. Several 100 miles from Harlow Creek, Georgia, from her father's house and his ledger books, and the pearl ring she dropped in the river, and Preston Holt and his 2 dead wives, and the arranged future she'd walked away from in the dark. She was in a room with a lock. She had the key. That was enough for now. That was more than enough. That was more than she'd had in a year, and she needed to let that be true without immediately reaching forward toward what might go wrong next. But there it was, surfacing now in the quiet of this small room the way certain questions surfaced when the motion stopped. What if Cal Reavis was patient, the way certain men were patient, the way a trap was patient, the way anything willing to wait for the right moment could afford patience? She'd been watching his hands. She'd learned to watch hands, and his hands had done nothing but exactly what he'd said they were going to do. She kept the key under her pillow. Old habits had deep roots. She wasn't ready to pretend otherwise. She was almost asleep when she heard something. Not a sound from inside the house, not footsteps in the hall, not the specific slow tread on floorboards that she'd spent a year learning to listen for in her father's house. Something outside. From the direction of the barn, one of the horses making a sound of complaint about something, and then Cal's voice, low and steady, saying something she couldn't make out through the wall, but could tell by the cadence was reassurance. The tone a person used when they wanted something unsettled to understand. It was going to be all right. She didn't know why that was the thing that finally let her fall asleep. The sound of a man talking gently to a horse in the dark. She was gone before she decided to stop listening. 3 hours later, she woke from a dream she couldn't hold on to and lay in the darkness of the room in Broken Spur, Texas. She knew within 30 seconds exactly where she was and why, and how she'd gotten there. The disorientation that had plagued her in every boarding house for 11 nights didn't come. The room was unfamiliar. The lock was not. She'd been crying. Not in the dream. Here. She'd been doing it quietly in the way she'd learned to do things that had to be done but couldn't be observed. The way you learned anything when the cost of being seen was too high. She pressed the back of her hand to her face. Sat up. Outside the window, the cottonwood made its faint sound in the wind, leaves on leaves, water on stone. She lay back down and pressed her face into the pillow because the pillow muffled things, and because she was tired in a way that 11 days of coach travel hadn't caused tired in the way of someone who has been afraid for a long time and has only just stopped, which turned out to be its own particular exhaustion. A year of calculating, a year of measuring rooms for exits, a year of making herself smaller and quieter and less visible until she'd almost forgotten what the original size had been. She was so tired she let herself be tired for a while. She couldn't have known that, on the other side of the thin plank wall, Cal Reavis had woken at the first sound, had sat up in his narrow bed in the dark and stayed very still and listened, had gotten up after a moment, quietly, and come down the short hallway and sat down on the floor outside her door, not to listen for specifics, not to wait for her to stop, just to be on the other side of the wall in case being there was the thing that helped. He'd done this for Ada. In the months Ada was sick and the nights were hard, he'd sat outside whatever room she was trying to sleep in and just stayed. She'd told him once it was foolish. He'd said maybe. She'd told him she could hear him breathing and it kept her calm. He'd said then it wasn't foolish. He sat on the floor outside Mae Dutton's door, with his back against the wall and his legs stretched out across the seat. The narrow listened to the sounds inside the room change from something effortful to something quieter, to something that might have been sleep. He stayed until he was certain. Then he went back to his own room and lay on his back and looked at the ceiling in the dark. He thought about a woman who'd gotten on a coach in Georgia and ridden several hundred miles into the unknown, on the strength of 3 letters, and whatever she'd been running from being worse than whatever she was running toward. He thought about the way she'd asked about the cottonwood before she'd looked at the house. He thought about her saying open instead of empty when she meant the same thing, and then deciding there was a difference worth making. He thought, whatever she needs to decide whether to stay, give her the time to decide it. This was not a complicated resolution. He'd made more complicated ones about fence lines and water rights. But it felt important to say it clearly to himself in the dark, the way he'd learned to state the most important things plainly. Because plain things were harder to talk yourself out of later. Whatever she needs, give her the time. Outside, the cottonwood moved in the night wind. Inside, for the first time in a very long time, Mae Dutton slept without listening for footsteps. In the morning, Cal woke at 5 the way he always did. His body had been adjusted to ranch hours for so long that sleeping past the first gray light felt like a kind of negligence. He dressed, Went out to the barn, did the morning feeding with the efficiency of long practice. Sage ate with the contentment of an animal who expected to be well treated and considered this arrangement satisfactory. Dune ate steadily, working through his hay with professional dedication. Flint knocked his feed bucket over, apparently on purpose, then looked at Cal with an expression suggesting this was Cal's fault. Every morning, Cal said. Every single morning, Flint. Flint offered no comment on this observation. Cal came back inside and started the coffee and stood at the stove and looked at the closed door to Mae's room. At the sliver of quiet beneath it, he thought about the sounds he'd heard through the wall last night and the specific reaction in his chest when he'd heard them, which was a reaction he hadn't anticipated and wasn't entirely sure what to do with yet. He poured 2 cups when the coffee was ready, set one at the table, held the other. He heard movement on the other side of the door, a pause. Then the soft, unmistakable sound of a lock turning from the inside. She came out in the gray dress, hair pinned simply, face composed in the careful way of a woman who had practiced composing it for an audience, and had become very good at it. The bruise along her cheekbone had faded further overnight. He didn't look at it directly. She'd know if he looked at it directly. "Coffee's ready," he said. "Good." She moved to the table. He set the cup in front of her, and she wrapped both hands around it like she was cold, despite the fact that Texas had not dropped below 70 degrees all night. "How'd you sleep?" She looked at him over the rim of the cup. Something moved through her expression, the assessment of what it was safe to say. The calculation he suspected she performed constantly and had been performing so long it had become invisible to her. "Better than I have in a while." He nodded and went back to the eggs. Neither of them mentioned the other thing. Some things were better made into facts, gradually he'd found, rather than spoken about before they had enough weight to hold themselves up. He was halfway through the eggs when he heard it. Hoofbeats from the South Road. Fast. The specific rhythm of someone riding with news rather than visiting. Cal was at the window before the eggs were done. Mae had gone still at the table behind him, her cup halfway to her mouth, her whole body returning to that particular stillness he'd recognized in town. The listening posture. The posture of someone who'd learned that unexpected arrivals were rarely good news. The rider was Judge Owen Stagg. He came into the yard at a pace that meant no preamble and no small talk. Cal was out the door before Stagg had his horse fully stopped. Stagg was a big man, moving fast, and the lines in his face were set in the way they got when he was carrying something serious. He looked past Cal at the open doorway where Mae had appeared in the frame, looked at her, then at Cal. "We've got a problem." Cal stepped so he was standing between Stagg and the doorway, not blocking Stagg, just being in the path of the news first. "What kind?" "The kind that rode in on last night's coach and is currently buying drinks at the Iron Wheel for anyone willing to answer questions." Stagg pulled off his hat and held it in both hands. Well-dressed man. City clothes, city manners. Asking about a woman who came in on the stage yesterday. Offering $100 for anyone who can tell him where she went. The number landed with its full weight. "He give a name?" Cal asked. Stagg looked past him to Mae, still in the doorway, her face gone the particular white of someone who already knows the answer before the question finishes forming. "Called himself Preston Holt," Stagg said. "Says the woman was his betrothed. Says she left due to a misunderstanding. Says she hasn't been well. Says her family is worried." Mae's hand found the doorframe. Cal turned to look at her. Her eyes were on Stagg, but she wasn't seeing Stagg. She was somewhere else entirely, somewhere with city-dressed men's, and smooth voices and explanations delivered with hands and pearl rings, sent as down payments on things that were never for sale. "Mae." He said her name quietly and she came back, looked at him, the gray eyes holding hers. "Nobody is taking you anywhere." She looked at him for a long moment, then at Stagg, then back at Cal, and the thing moving through her expression wasn't relief yet, not quite. Because relief required a level of trust that a person didn't build in 16 hours, no matter how much they might want to. But it was the beginning of the question. The beginning of what it might feel like someday, maybe, if the evidence kept accumulating the way it had started to accumulate, to actually believe that sentence. "How many people has he talked to?" Cal asked. "Fletcher Cord refused him outright," Stagg said. "Told me afterward. Said something about the way Holt talked about the woman bothered him, like he was describing property that had wandered off." Cal's jaw tightened in the way it had last night over beans and cornbread when Mae had said the word currency. "We need to think," Cal said. "We do," Stagg agreed. Mae stepped down from the doorway into the yard, still pale, still standing steady, chin up, the look of a woman who was done being surprised by Preston Holt, but was not done deciding what to do about him. "I know what we need to do," she said. Her voice was even, steadier than it had been yesterday. Something had clarified overnight in that locked room with the single key and the sound of a man speaking gently to horses in the dark. Cal looked at her. "Tell me," he said, and she did. Mae stood in the yard with the morning sun already working hard against the back of her neck, and said it plainly. The way she'd learned to say things that needed saying before she talked herself out of them. "If I'm already married, Preston Holt has no legal claim on me. Whatever contract he made with my father is void. No arrangement, no agreement, no amount of money he paid for something that was never anyone's to sell." She looked at Cal, not asking, presenting. "I'm proposing we get married today, before he finds out where I am." The yard went quiet in the way. Yards went quiet when something large and irreversible was being considered. Judge Stagg stopped turning his hat in his hands. Somewhere in the corral, Flint shifted his weight with the dramatic energy of an animal who had opinions about everything. Cal looked at her for a long time, the gray eyes doing what they'd done since the moment she stepped off the coach, actually looking, measuring what was there, rather than what he wanted to see. He was trying to determine whether she was certain, or whether she was afraid, and had spent so long dressing fear as certainty that she couldn't tell the difference anymore. She had spent a long time doing exactly that. She understood why he needed to check. "Mae." His voice was quiet. "That's a permanent solution to what might be a temporary problem. Holt doesn't do temporary problems." She kept her voice level, factual, the way she'd learned to be factual when her hands wanted to shake. "I've seen what his permanent solutions look like. I know the names of the women who found out what they were." Cal looked at Stagg. Stagg spread his hands. "She's right about the law, legal marriage, valid ceremony, witnessed and filed. His claim evaporates. He can't take a wife from her husband without cause, and there's no cause here." Cal said the judge's name the way a man said a name when he wanted one word to carry several sentences at once. "Is this moving too fast? Are you hearing what I'm hearing? Tell me if I'm being a fool." Stagg answered the sentences rather than the word. "I've performed 11 marriages in my time as justice of the peace in this county. 9 of them took longer than this one would. Both the fast ones turned out better than 6 of the slow ones." A pause. "I'm not saying that's a statistic. I'm saying speed isn't the variable that matters." Cal looked back at Mae. The morning light was coming in at the low angle of early hours, the kind of light that didn't flatter or soften anything, just showed things as they were. He thought about her saying open instead of empty, and knowing there was a difference worth making. He thought about her going straight to the cottonwood before she looked at the house. He thought about her starting to help in the kitchen before anyone asked, and about the sounds he'd heard through the wall, and about sitting on the hallway floor and feeling for the first time in 3 years like his presence was doing something useful. He thought about Ada. Ada would have said, "You already know, Cal. Stop making her wait while you convince yourself." "This isn't how I intended to ask," he said. Mae blinked. Something moved across her face. Not surprise exactly. The recalibration of a person who'd estimated a variable incorrectly and was now adjusting the equation. "You intended to ask eventually." "Yes, a beat. One beat of something neither of them named." "How eventually?" "I hadn't set a timeline." He held her gaze. "I was going to give you time to decide if you wanted to stay, and if you decided to stay, I was going to ask you properly, with some kind of notice, probably with Stagg's help on the wording." Stagg made a sound that might have been a stifled laugh. He covered it with a cough. Neither of them looked at him. "Ask me now," Mae said. "Not properly, just ask." Cal looked at her for one more moment. "Then, Mae Dutton, will you marry me?" Not inflected like a question, stated like a man who knew precisely what he was saying. Yes, also not a question, also not a performance. A word carrying its full weight. Stagg pulled out a pocket watch, consulted it, and put it away with the brisk efficiency of a man who had just added a task to a morning that was already complicated. "I'll need 2 witnesses besides myself, and I'll need someone who can ride to the county seat today to file the paperwork, before Holt starts asking the right questions of the right people." Cal was already moving, the decisive motion of a man who had identified a problem with an actual solution, and was not inclined to spend more time discussing it than necessary. George Mabry, for one. He's been in this county 30 years and he has no patience for men who throw money around in saloons to buy information. And Fletcher Cord, Stagg said. He already refused Holt once. He won't appreciate being made relevant to this situation again, and that'll make him thorough. Go back into town, Cal told Stagg. Find Fletcher. Keep Holt occupied if he's still at the iron wheel. How exactly do I keep a man like that occupied? Tell him you're investigating a report of someone impersonating a legitimate creditor. He won't know if it's true and he won't want to find out the hard way that it is. Stagg considered this for exactly 2 seconds. That's creative. It's your job to make it convincing. Stagg went. Cal turned to Mae. Will you be all right here alone for an hour? There it was again. The question framed as a question. The choice offered rather than assumed. She'd been on this property for less than 24 hours and she'd already learned to notice when he did that. Learned to notice it because the contrast was so stark against the texture of the past year that it registered each time like a sound in a quiet room. I'll be fine. She met his eyes. Go, he went. Mae stood alone in the yard in front of a log house in Texas. The cottonwood moved overhead. In the corral, Flint had come to the fence and was watching her with the focused attention of an animal who found human drama considerably more interesting than whatever was happening on his side of the rails. Don't look at me like that, she told him. Flint flicked one ear, remained at the fence, continued watching. She went inside and sat at the table and put both hands flat on the wood surface and breathed in through her nose and out slow. The practice she'd developed in the past year for moments when the walls of a situation were closing in, and she needed to remind her body it was still capable of moving through them. She was getting married today, to a man she had known for less than 1 full day. She sat with that and didn't look away from it. She was getting married to a man who had put a lock on her door and given her the only key, who had sat down on the hallway floor in the middle of the night and never once knocked, who had said the word currency over supper without flinching from it and not backed away from what it meant, who had apparently already been planning to ask her. That part kept rising to the surface. The apparently, the already. She kept turning it over and examining its underside. It didn't look like manipulation from any angle. It looked like a man who had read her letters and formed a considered opinion about the kind of person she was, and had been willing to give her time to form her own considered opinion about him. Who would have waited? Indefinitely, maybe. And until she was ready, she'd had enough of men who didn't wait. She stood up, went to her room, took the other 2 dresses off the hooks behind the door and laid them on the bed. One was dark green wool, far too heavy for Texas in August, entirely wrong for everything about this landscape and this life. The other was blue cotton, lighter, worn at the cuffs. The dress she'd bought with her own money at a dry goods store in Macon during the journey west, when the dress she'd been wearing had finally given up entirely. She put on the blue one. She unpinned her hair and repinned it more carefully than she had in months, with the precision her schooling had drilled into her, until it became automatic, a precision that had never once in her life been applied to something she herself had chosen to do. She smoothed the dress with both hands, looked in the small cracked mirror above the washstand. A woman looking back at her who was making a decision rather than having one made for her. That was new. That was the thing she was going to hold on to. Cal came back in 40 minutes with George Mabry, who was a compact man with silver-white hair and the sun-baked, unhurried look of someone who had been in Texas before it was entirely clear what Texas intended to become. He looked at Mae with the assessing calm of a man who required facts rather than impressions before forming an opinion. Miss Dutton. His voice was dry as the creek bed outside. Mr. Mabry. Cal says you need a witness. I do. He looked at Cal, then back at Mae. Cal also tells me there's a man from back east throwing money at people in my town. There is. George's jaw set. I watched a man do that during the drought of '78. Bought out 3 good ranchers who needed the cash. Every one of them regretted it within the year. He looked at Mae with something that might have been respect working its way toward the surface from considerable depth. I don't like men who do business that way. Stagg returned 20 minutes after that with Fletcher Cord, who arrived smelling of road dust and wearing the expression of a man who had spent a highly instructive morning. He'd managed 40 minutes of conversation with Preston Holt at the iron wheel by representing himself as a rancher with a complicated water rights dispute and an apparently limitless need to explain it in exhaustive detail. Man has the patience of someone who's used to waiting for things to come to him. Fletcher accepted the cup of water Mae handed him without breaking stride. Very smooth, very still. He watches the whole room when he's talking to you. Like he's running 2 conversations and you're only in one of them. Mae knew that watching. She had grown up adjacent to it, Holt at her father's dinner table, appearing to attend to the man on his left while his eyes moved through the room with the cool inventory of someone cataloging assets and assigning values. "Is he still at the saloon?" Cal asked. "Was when I left. He's got his man with him still. Young fellow, dark-haired. Does the note-taking?" "He brought someone with him," Stagg said. And the way he said it carried a weight it hadn't carried before. Not a detail, a recalibration of the situation. He didn't come here to ask questions and leave. Mae said it before anyone else could. He came with a plan. 2 people on a coach means he intended to stay long enough to execute it. The room considered that. Stagg sat at the table with his materials, the worn Bible, and the document that would turn a personal decision into a legal fact. Mae stood beside Cal, and she was aware with a precision she hadn't anticipated of the exact distance between his arm and hers. 3 inches, the distance of a man being very deliberate about not crowding her. Even now, even here, even at this particular moment. She moved 3 inches closer. He didn't react, but she felt him notice. Stagg kept it short, which she appreciated. The long version of wedding ceremonies had always seemed designed for the audience, rather than the participants. All that language between 2 people, and the thing they had actually come to do. When he reached the vows, Cal said his plainly and without hesitation, which was exactly how she'd known he would say them, because he didn't appear to say anything he didn't mean. Then it was her turn, she said, and because it felt insufficient, because the weight of the moment was too considerable for 2 words to hold by themselves, she added, "I mean it." Cal looked at her. Something in the gray eyes went deeper. "I know," he said quietly enough that it was only for her. Stagg produced a ring from his vest pocket, a simple band he kept for ceremonies, where couples arrived unprepared, which apparently happened more often than might be expected in a county like this one. Cal looked at it. "I don't have one." A pause. "I should have thought of that." "I have something," Mae said. She'd been carrying it since she left Harlow Creek, not because she'd known she would need it, not because she'd been planning this specific use for it. "Would you treat them with kindness?" She'd carried it because it had belonged to her mother, and she'd carried everything of her mother's. That shocked man, and those were the things she would carry until she couldn't anymore. A ring. Gold, thin, with a small engraved leaf pattern worn almost smooth by decades of wear. Her mother had worn it on her right hand because her left had been taken long ago by the ring her father had put there. Mae held it out. Cal took it carefully between thumb and forefinger and looked at it. He turned it in the light from the window. Then he looked at Mae, and there was something in his face she would spend a long time afterward trying to name. Something that understood what the ring cost her to offer and what she meant by offering it. Something that knew the difference between a gesture and a reckoning. He put it on her finger. It fit. Stagg said the words that made it official. George Mabry and Fletcher Cord signed their names on the witness line. The paperwork was real and legal and already beginning its journey toward the county clerk's office in Stagg's saddlebag. They shook hands around the table. George said he had to get back to the store, and he hoped they'd have a quiet afternoon, in the tone of a man who knew perfectly well they probably wouldn't. Fletcher said he was going to take the long way back through town and see whether Holt was still at the iron wheel. Then they were gone. And it was just Cal and Mae at the table, with the signed document and the blue dress, and the ring that had been her mother's, and the cottonwood moving outside, and the full measure of what had just happened, settling into the room like weather coming in. She looked at the ring on her hand. He looked at it too. "Tell me about your mother," he said. She hadn't expected that, not that question, not first. She'd expected the logistical question, what happens now? What do we do next? She'd expected the reassurance question, you're safe. It's going to be all right. She'd even expected a comfortable silence that didn't require anything of either of them. She had not expected, "Tell me about your mother," she told him. Told him about Catherine Dutton, who had played piano entirely by ear, and had never been able to explain how she did it when asked, who had grown a kitchen garden in Georgia clay that everyone said wouldn't support one, who had possessed the particular kind of grace that came from a woman who had made peace with a difficult life, without ever letting that peace become an acceptance of things that should not be accepted. who had pressed wildflowers between the pages of books and left them there like small discoveries for later, who had died when Mae was 22 and left behind a watercolor, a thin gold ring, and a daughter still learning what it meant to want things for herself without apologizing for the wanting. Cal listened, not politely, the way he did everything with his full attention aimed at a specific place and held there. When she finished, he said, "She sounds like someone who deserved more than what she got." She did. Mae looked at the ring. "So do I." "Yes, direct, no qualification." "You do." She met his eyes. "I'm starting to believe that." They sat with that for a moment that stretched in the comfortable way of moments that didn't need to be cut short. Then hoofbeats again. Not Fletcher returning. The rhythm was different, faster, irregular in the way of someone riding with urgency rather than purpose. Cal was at the door before Mae had fully processed the sound. Fletcher pulled his horse up hard in the yard. His face said what his mouth hadn't gotten to yet. "He's gone from the saloon." Fletcher's horse was blowing, sides heaving. Him and his man both. "Horses gone from the livery." Keeper said they headed west. West. Mae stood in the doorway behind Cal. The word landed in her chest with its full implication. West was one direction from Broken Spur. West was where the ranch was. West was where she was standing right now. "How long ago?" Cal asked. 20 minutes. Maybe less. Cal turned back and looked at Mae. She could see him calculating. A man with resources and a plan and a hired note-taker, and 20 minutes of head start on the one road that led to this property. "He's coming here," she said. "Probably." "Then let him come." She said it before she'd finished processing it, and then she processed it and found she still meant every word. "Stagg filed that paperwork today." "He did." "Then Holt has nothing. Whatever he told my father, whatever my father signed, it's void." She looked at Cal steadily. "You said the room was mine. You said I could choose. I'm choosing to stay, and I'm choosing to be standing here when he comes." Cal held her gaze, not arguing, not agreeing yet either, seeing whether she was sure. She was sure. He turned to Fletcher. "Find Stagg. Tell him to get out here and bring George Mabry on the way." He glanced back at Mae. "I think we're going to want witnesses for this next part too." Fletcher went fast. The 20 minutes that followed were not comfortable. Mae stood on the porch while Cal moved around the property with the calm efficiency of a man who was not exactly preparing for a confrontation but was not unprepared for one. He checked her once, asked if she was certain. Heard her say yes and treated yes as the complete sentence it was. She was afraid. She could say that plainly to herself in the part of her mind that didn't have to perform for anyone. Her hands were cold despite the August heat. She knew this specific flavor of fear, had felt it before, standing outside her father's study to tell him she wouldn't comply. The difference between then and now was the difference between standing at the edge of a drop with someone behind you and standing at it with someone beside you. Same drop. Different physics entirely. The cottonwood moved overhead. She watched it because it was the oldest thing in the yard, and the most settled, and she needed something settled to look at. She heard them before she saw them. 2 horses coming up the west road at a measured, deliberate pace. The kind of pace that announced itself. That said, "I have decided to arrive, and my arriving is the event." Preston Holt came into the yard on a dark bay horse that cost more than the entire corral combined. He was exactly as she remembered, which was exactly as she'd known he would be, because men like Holt didn't alter themselves for settings. The navy vest. The silver at his temples. The bone-smooth face that held its expression like something had been removed from it, some essential component of human readability, leaving only the performance of feeling in its place. His man came in behind him, younger, dark-haired, the leather case across his saddle. Holt looked at the house. He looked at Cal standing in the yard. He looked at Mae on the porch, and the look lasted one beat too long before his expression rearranged itself into something approximating warmth. Evelyn. He'd always used her full name. She had always hated it. "Mae," she said it from the porch. "My name is Mae." Holt looked at Cal. The assessment was quick and complete and concealed under the surface smoothness the way a current ran under still water. "You must be Mr. Reavis. I appreciate you looking after my fiancée during what must have been a confusing time for her. She has a tendency toward impulsive decisions when she's distressed." Cal looked at Holt for a moment. The levelness of it was more pointed than any volume would have been. "She's not your fiancée." Holt paused, adjusted. "I understand there may be some confusion about the arrangements." "No confusion." Cal's voice didn't change register by a single degree. "She's my wife. Judge Stagg performed the ceremony this morning." George Mabry and Fletcher Cord witnessed it. The paperwork is on its way to the county clerk. By the end of the day it'll be filed and recorded. Holt looked at his man. Some communication passed between them that Mae couldn't read. Then Holt looked back at Cal with a new quality in his attention. The social calculation had been set aside. What was underneath it was something harder and less polished. The arrangement with her father. Stagg came around the corner of the barn on horseback, and the timing surprised everyone in the yard, possibly including Stagg himself. He dismounted with the dignified speed of a man who'd been riding hard and wasn't going to show it. A woman of legal age cannot be contracted into marriage without her own consent. Her father's signature doesn't supersede her standing as an adult under the law. Stagg straightened his vest. What you paid him is a private matter between you and a man who was selling something he didn't own. I've been justice of the peace in this county for 11 years. That's the law as it stands and as it will stand. Holt looked at Stagg, at Cal, at Mae on the porch. George Mabry had come through the front gate quiet as dust, standing near the corral fence. Fletcher had come in behind Stagg. 4 men in the yard, 1 woman on a porch, and Holt's note-taker, who had stopped taking notes entirely. Mae walked off the porch, down the 2 steps, across the yard. She stopped 6 feet from Preston Holt and looked at him directly, which was not something she'd had the ground under her feet to do before. He was taller than her. He'd always used that. She'd learned that specific lesson early, the way certain men position themselves in space to remind you of dimensions you couldn't change. But she had been carrying something since she left Harlow Creek that she was ready to use now. "Francis," she said. Then, "Margaret." The first real crack in Holt's expression opened and held. "I know their names." Mae's voice came out steadier than she felt, and she was grateful to it for that. "I know how they died. A breath. Even. Measured. Francis at the bottom of a staircase in a house full of people who were interviewed and sent home. Margaret from an illness no one could specifically name that progressed quickly and left no useful record." She took one more breath, slow. "I also know that the people who had the most reason to ask questions about both of those deaths were paid very well to ask different questions instead. And I know what that smells like, because I grew up close enough to money like yours to recognize what it does when it needs something to disappear." Holt said, "You're making dangerous accusations. I'm making observations about patterns." She looked at him with everything she'd been carrying for a year. Everything she'd had to look away from and swallow down, because there'd been no safe place to set it. "I'm also done. Done running from you. Done calculating whether I'm far enough away. Done waking up measuring the distance between where I am and where you might be." She didn't look away from him, not for a single moment. "This is where I am. This man is my husband. That tree has been standing here longer than you've been alive. And it will be standing here after you're gone." One beat of absolute quiet. Then, leave. Something moved through Holt's face that was not the hairline fracture from before. Something that went through the entire surface of the performance and showed what was underneath for just a second. Something that was in fact anger, and underneath the anger, something else, the specific expression of a man who had moved through the world for a very long time, without anyone saying no to him, and had genuinely expected to leave this property with what he came for. He looked at Mae, at Cal, at Stagg with his paperwork, at George and Fletcher at the fence, at his own man, who had been useless for the past several minutes and showed no signs of recovering. He straightened his vest. "You'll regret this." Addressed to Mae, the smooth voice stripped down to something thinner and less composed underneath. She looked at him without flinching. "I've already regretted things. This isn't going to be one of them." Holt looked at Cal one final time, the look of a man making a record of something for later use. Then he turned his horse and rode out of the yard at the same measured pace he'd arrived, except that now it said something entirely different. Now it said, a man removing himself from a situation he couldn't control while maintaining the appearance of choosing to leave. His man followed. The leather case stayed closed. Nobody in the yard spoke until the sound of the hoofbeats had gone completely from the air. Then Fletcher Cord exhaled a volume of air that suggested he'd been holding it for some time. Stagg put his hat back on. George pushed himself off the fence rail and said, "Congratulations on the marriage." Said it to both of them equally, and headed back toward the gate. Fletcher said something to Stagg about the ride to the county seat, and they went together. Then it was just Cal and Mae in the yard with the afternoon moving toward them, and the cottonwood, doing what it always did, and Preston Holt somewhere on the West Road growing smaller. Mae's legs decided that now was an appropriate time to reassess their commitment to the project. She didn't fall, but she found the corral fence with her hand and leaned on it, and Cal was there before she'd finished leaning, not touching her, not crowding her, just present, just close enough to catch her if catching was needed. "I'm fine," she said. "I know. My legs are just, I know, a breath, too." The fence was solid. Good. She'd needed something solid. I didn't know I was going to say that about Francis and Margaret. I hadn't planned it. Cal looked at her. It needed saying. It did. It needed saying, and nobody else was going to say it. She straightened. The fence helped, so I said it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yesterday you told me you were learning, you weren't currency." She remembered. Over beans and cornbread at the mismatched table, the word had come out before she'd finished deciding whether to say it. "I remember. Today you told a man with lawyers and money and influence in 2 states to leave your yard." He held her gaze. "Our yard." She caught that, the hour, the ease of it, like he'd been saying it for months rather than minutes. "Our yard," she said again, more deliberately. "I've been here less than 2 days, but you put a lock on the door, and you sat on the floor in the hallway, and you asked instead of assumed, and you married me this morning, without making me feel like I was asking for something I didn't deserve." She looked at him directly. She was getting less afraid of that. "This is my yard, too." Something moved through his face, private enough that she almost looked away to give it room. He looked at the cottonwood, at the fence line, at whatever men looked at when they were holding something they hadn't expected to be given. Then he looked back at her. "Yes," he said, simply, completely. "It is." The rest of that afternoon moved the way afternoons moved after events that had required everything slowly, with the particular texture of things that had been disturbed beginning to settle again. Mae helped Cal with the late feeding because her hands still needed occupation, and standing still felt too much like waiting for the next thing, and she'd done enough waiting. She learned that Sage, the bay mare, was calm and attentive, and approached the evening routine with professional seriousness. She learned that Flint, the paint gelding, would accept exactly 1 ear scratch before walking away, not because he disliked it, but because acknowledging that he'd enjoyed something was apparently incompatible with his sense of self. "He's been like this since I bought him." Cal was watching Flint execute a dignified retreat to the far end of the corral. "Paid $60 for him. Was he worth it? Ask me in a year. A beat. Though I'll probably still say yes." She looked at Cal sideways. He was watching Flint with the particular affection of someone who had decided that a difficult thing was still worth the trouble, and it was not a subtle metaphor. She was fairly certain he knew she knew it wasn't. They made supper together again. Quieter than the night before. A more settled quiet, not the quiet of 2 people who didn't know each other yet, but the quiet of 2 people who had been through something together and were resting on the other side of it. She'd said Francis and Margaret out loud in the afternoon air. The sky had not fallen. Holt had ridden away. She was standing in a kitchen in Texas with her mother's ring on her finger. She thought about Francis's wedding ring, wherever it was now. She thought about Margaret's. She thought about the fact that someone should know their names, and she was someone, and she now knew them, and that was a small thing and also not a small thing at all. After supper, Cal cleared the table and she watched him and said, "Tell me about Ada." He stopped moving, not for long, then started again, slower. "What do you want to know? What do you want to tell me?" He was quiet while he moved around the kitchen with the evening tasks, and she didn't rush him. She'd learned in less than 2 days that his quiet was working quiet, not withholding quiet. The distinction mattered. He told her Ada had come to Texas from Tennessee, not on any arrangement, but because she'd had a brother ranching in the next county and had come out for a summer visit and decided Tennessee was no longer the point. She'd been practical and direct and had very strong opinions about soil drainage, and no patience whatsoever for ceremony of any kind, but considerable patience for actual hard work. She'd made the patchwork quilt on the bed in Mae's room. Mae held that information. The quilt Mae had slept under last night. The quilt whose colors had faded to memory. "You kept it," she said. "It's a good quilt." He looked at her, and there was the complicated thing in the gray eyes again. "I kept everything of hers that still did something useful. The quilt keeps you warm. The toolbox in the barn still holds tools. The seed packets she saved from the garden are still viable if someone planted them." A pause. Keeping her things wasn't the same as not being ready for something else. I want you to know that. Mae looked at the ring on her finger, at the thin engraved leaf pattern worn smooth by years of wear. Her mother's ring, on her finger, in a kitchen in Texas, 300 miles from the life she'd been born into. She would have had opinions about me, Mae said. She would have. The almost smile arrived, made it all the way this time. She'd have said you have better posture than she expected for someone who'd spent 11 days on a stage. You already told me you thought that. I'm telling you she'd have thought it too, for the same reason. He held her gaze across the kitchen. She liked people who stood up straight when they were scared. Said it was the truest kind of bravery, because it didn't wait to feel better before it moved. Outside, the cottonwood moved in the evening wind. Somewhere out on the prairie, something called once and went quiet. The lamp on the table made the kitchen warm in the literal sense of the word. Mae was in Broken Spur, Texas. She was married. The paperwork was on its way to the county clerk. Holt was somewhere on the West Road. Francis and Margaret's names had been said out loud in the afternoon air, and the air hadn't rejected them. Cal, she said. He was at the sink. He turned. I'm glad I got on the coach. She let that sit for a second before she finished it. I'm glad it went 11 days instead of stopping somewhere else. And I'm glad the letter I answered was yours. He stood there with the dish towel in his hands and looked at her with the full weight of what that had cost her written clearly in his face. Because he understood what it cost. Because he'd been paying attention to the cost of things since the moment she stepped off the stage and understood exactly how much each small act of trust had required. So am I, he said, the way he said everything that mattered. She went to her room, changed into her sleeping clothes, lay down on the quilt that Ada had made, and looked at the ring that had been her mother's, and listened to the cottonwood through the north window. The door was unlocked. She hadn't locked it. She fell asleep to the wind in the tree, and the sound of Cal moving quietly through the house, and the knowledge, working its way into her bones, like something she'd needed for a very long time, that this was where she had chosen to be, not where she'd run to. Not where circumstance had deposited her, where she had chosen. The weeks after Preston Holt rode out of the yard settled into the ranch, the way weather settled not announced. Just present, just there one morning when you walked outside and realized something had changed in the quality of the air around you. Mae noticed it first in small things. The way she stopped checking the West Road every time the wind moved through the grass. The way she slept past the gray pre-dawn instead of snapping awake at it like something had been waiting for her in the dark. The way her hands moved through the morning work without that low-level arithmetic, running underneath the constant background calculation of threat and distance and available exits that she'd been running so long it had begun to feel like the natural condition of being alive. She was still doing the math sometimes. She knew it. Old habits didn't pull up by the root just because the ground changed under them, but the intervals between calculations were stretching longer, and the calculations themselves resolved faster in favor of whatever she was actually doing, rather than whatever she might need to do if everything went wrong at once. That was progress. She was choosing to call it that. Judge Stagg rode out 3 weeks after the confrontation with the filed paperwork, sealed in an official envelope, and the particular satisfaction of a man who had used the law the way it was supposed to be used, as a shield rather than a weapon, which in his experience was the less common application. He stayed for coffee, delivered the secondary news the same way he delivered everything, plainly, without ornamentation, the way a man delivered things when he respected the person receiving them enough not to dress them up. Holt had left Broken Spur the morning after his failed visit to the ranch. Him and his man both, horses gone from the livery before sunup, no forwarding word left at the iron wheel. His note-taker had sent one telegram from the local office before they departed, addressed to a law firm in the city. Content approximating, situation resolved differently than anticipated. Advise client on recovery of investment. Which means he's going after my father, Mae said. That's my reading. Stagg turned his coffee cup in both hands. Though your father signed a contract to deliver something he had no legal right to deliver. So that conversation is going to be complicated for everyone involved. She thought about her father in his study with the ledger book open on the desk, the one he used as a prop, more than a tool, the one that made him look like a man engaged in serious enterprise, rather than a man steadily dismantling everything around him, to service a debt that kept growing because he kept feeding it. She thought about him opening a letter from Holt's lawyers, about the particular kind of reckoning that arrived when you had sold something that didn't belong to you, and the buyer came back wanting a return on the investment. She examined what she felt about that and found it was not sympathy. "Good," she said. Stagg looked at her with the expression of a man who had watched enough human situations resolve and fail to resolve that he could recognize the difference without being told. "Yes," he said. "That's the correct answer." After he left, she went out to the kitchen garden, because her hands needed something with weight and resistance to them. The garden behind the house had been more weed than intention when she arrived, and she'd been working it for 3 weeks now, with a focus that sometimes surprised her when she stopped long enough to notice it. She didn't stop often. That was probably the point. She'd found the seed packets in the root cellar 2 weeks ago, small paper envelopes tucked in a wooden box on the second shelf, organized by type, each one labeled in a handwriting she didn't recognize, tidy and slanted, the handwriting of someone who'd been taught carefully, and had used the skill enough to make it her own. Ada's handwriting. Mae had known it before Cal confirmed it, because nobody organized seeds that way unless they intended to be present for the planting. Mae put them all in the ground, every one. She didn't know which would come up. Seeds kept too long in storage sometimes lost whatever mechanism made them reach toward light. But she planted them anyway because that was the decision you made before you knew the outcome. And she was done waiting for guarantees before she committed to things. Done waiting. Full stop. No qualifications. Cal found her there one evening and stood at the edge of what had been a weed patch for 3 years and was now recognizably something a person had made with intention. His face did the thing she'd been learning to read all summer, the shift that happened when something reached him that he hadn't seen coming. "Ada saved those seeds," he said. He crouched and touched the edge of a bean seedling with one finger. The careful touch of someone who understood that some things needed to be approached with patience. She used to say that gardening was an argument made in dirt. Said every time you put something in the ground, you were making a case for next season. Mae looked at what she'd built from what Ada had left behind. She left them there for someone to find. I think she did. Then I found them. Mae pulled a weed from between 2 rows and set it aside, and I planted them. So the argument continues. Cal stood. He looked at the garden for a long moment, and the expression on his face had the complicated layering of something that held grief and continuity and something else that didn't have a single clean name. "She'd have been glad it was you." Mae held not the grief in that statement, though the grief was present, and she felt it, but the other thing. The chain of it. One woman's intention reaching forward through time, and finding another woman's hands ready on the other end without either of them having planned it that way. The package arrived on a Wednesday in late September. Fletcher Cord brought it out with the expression of a man carrying something he couldn't quite classify, which for Fletcher was unusual. He was a man who classified things efficiently and moved on to the next thing. Brown paper wrapping. Mae's name on it in an unfamiliar handwriting. Postmarked from a city in Georgia she recognized, not Harlow Creek itself, but close enough to share the same sky. No return address. She set it on the table and looked at it until Cal came in from the barn. "Package," she said. He looked at it, then at her. "Do you want me here when you open it?" "Yes." Inside the brown paper, a small journal with a dark cover worn at the corners, and a single folded letter placed on top. The letter was from a woman named Cora Finch, 9 years in service to the Holt household. The letter said 9 years beginning before the first Mrs. Holt and ending in the aftermath of the second. Cora wrote in the careful language of someone who had chosen each word, understanding that paper could be used against its author by the right person with the right motivation. She said she had heard through a connection she didn't name that a woman in Texas had stood in a yard and said the names Francis and Margaret out loud to the man who had been their husband. She said she had been waiting 4 years for someone to say those names. She said the journal had belonged to Margaret, who had asked her to keep it until it could reach someone who would understand what it was. Mae set the letter down. She opened the journal to the first page. Margaret's handwriting was small and precise, and the first line read, "I am writing this because this is the one thing he cannot take from me." Mae closed it, not because she wasn't going to read it, because the full weight of what she was holding had arrived all at once, and she needed a moment to feel it before she could carry it properly. There was a difference between knowing the outline of a thing and holding the interior of it in your hands. She'd known about Francis and Margaret the way you knew about weather that had already passed, by the damage it left, by the shape of the aftermath, by accounts from people who'd been close enough to see. What she was holding now was the thing itself. Margaret's actual voice. Margaret's actual mind working through what was happening to her in real time and choosing to write it down anyway. The woman, not the circumstances of her death. She kept a record, Mae said. Cal stood at the edge of the kitchen and waited. She'd come to understand that he was very good at waiting without filling the space with himself. She knew what was happening, and she documented it. Mae looked at the closed cover. She planned for someone to find it, and someone did, because I said her name without knowing there was anyone left to hear it. Cal crossed the room and sat down across from her, and didn't say anything that would reduce it to something smaller than it was. Mae read the journal over 3 evenings. Cal gave her the lamp and the space and the quiet, and didn't ask about the contents until she was ready. She learned that Margaret Holt had been 24 when she married, and had understood within the first months what she'd walked into. The journal wasn't dramatic. That was the first thing that struck her, and that kept striking her with every page she turned. Margaret hadn't written like a woman in the middle of a crisis. She'd written with the methodical calm of someone building a record, because she understood that records outlasted a man's ability to explain things away. Records existed independent of whatever story he chose to tell afterward. Margaret had written, "I used to believe that danger announced itself, that you would feel it the way you felt weather coming, with enough warning to step aside. What I understand now is that it doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. Each thing by itself is explainable. Each thing by itself he has an accounting for. It is only in the totality, looking back over 6 months or a year, that the shape becomes visible. By then you are already inside it." Mae read that passage twice, then a third time, because she had grown up adjacent to this, not the same thing, but the same family of thing. Her father's house with its explanations and its individual incidents, that each made a kind of sense on their own, and only revealed their actual shape when you stood far enough back to see the pattern they made together. She'd never had language for what that accumulation felt like from the inside. Margaret had given her language for it, had constructed the words in the dark with no guarantee anyone would ever read them. And Mae felt the gift of that language the way you felt the gift of something you'd needed without knowing what to call the need. The last entry was dated 11 days before Margaret died. 3 sentences. "I am not well. I know what that means, and I know the reason for it. If you are reading this and you got out, then I am glad one of us did. Live loudly, take up the space. I spent too long being quiet about being alive, and I do not recommend it." Mae sat with those sentences for a long time after she closed the journal. Then she went and found Cal on the porch in the last of the September evening light, and sat beside him and told him what Margaret had written. Not a summary, the actual words, because the words were the point, and Margaret had chosen them carefully enough that they deserved to be passed along intact. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment in the working way. Then she was building a case in dirt, the same as the garden, making the argument and trusting that someone would eventually be there on the other end to receive it. She didn't know if anyone would be. Mae looked out at the dark prairie beyond the yard, at the sky doing its thing with the last of the light. She wrote it anyway. "Yes, I need Stagg to have a copy." She said it before she'd finished deciding to say it, which was how she'd learned to say the things that mattered before the cautious part of her brain could dress the impulse up as recklessness. Not the original. The original stays with me, but a copy in the hands of someone who knows what paper can do and where to send it when the time is right. "I'll ride in tomorrow. I'll ride with you." She looked at him. "I ride well enough now." The corner of his mouth moved. "You ride better than most people I've taught, which means I ride well, which means you ride well." She spent 2 evenings at the kitchen table copying Margaret's journal by lamplight, her own handwriting moving alongside Margaret's across the page's words, traveling from one woman's hand through Mae's hand across 4 years and the distance between Georgia and Texas. Cal sat in the armchair by the window reading and didn't comment on the work, and she was grateful for that, for the way he'd learned that being present wasn't the same as needing to participate in everything. They rode into Broken Spur the following morning. Mae on sage, Cal on dune. The trail looked different from horseback than it had from the wagon. On her first day, lower and more navigable. The distances between landmarks making a different kind of sense when you were the one setting the pace. She noticed somewhere around the halfway point that she wasn't counting Sage's strides. The way she'd counted them, her first few weeks of writing, that unconscious tallying of an exit route, the measurement of how quickly she could redirect if something went wrong. She was just riding, moving through the landscape because she decided to move through it, on a horse that had turned out to have more patience than flint and more personality than dune. And she thought of Sunday briefly, the chestnut quarter horse her father had sold when the first debts arrived, and thought, there you are. There's where that loss went. It went here. Into this. Stagg took the copied pages and held them with the care he brought to document at legal weight, which these did, though not in the way most documents in his office did. He said he knew people who knew people. He said he couldn't promise outcomes, but he could promise the copy would travel further than his county line. He looked at Mae over the papers. You know Holt will eventually hear about this. He can hear about it, Mae said. The copy will still exist. Stagg held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once, the nod of a man who recognized when something had been correctly understood and didn't need to be said again. On the ride back, the prairie was moving toward fall, the grasses going gold at the tips, the sky spending everything it had on the late afternoon light the way it always did. She and Cal moved well together on the trail, the two horses having worked out their accommodation long ago and finding it still satisfactory. The news about Preston Holt came on a Thursday in late October. Fletcher Cord rode out in the mid-morning with the expression of a man who had been turning something over the entire ride and still hadn't resolved it into a shape he knew what to do with. He had a letter from a contact in Georgia, a woman who worked in a boarding house near Holt's property, and had an arrangement with Fletcher's cousin about the occasional exchange of regional news. The letter said that Preston Holt had been found at the bottom of the main staircase in his house on a Tuesday morning, neck broken. The housekeeper had arrived at 6 and found him at 7 when she reached the front hallway. The investigation had taken 2 days. The conclusion was accident. Large house, dark staircase, a man of his habits. Fletcher read it aloud at the kitchen table. When he finished, the three of them sat in a silence that had several layers to it, and none of the layers were simple. Mae was the first to speak. She didn't say anything, not at first. She pressed her hands flat on the table surface, both palms down, the way she'd learned to anchor herself when the ground shifted, and she looked at the letter, and she thought about Francis at the bottom of a staircase in a house full of people. She thought about Margaret writing in the dark with 11 days left. She thought about Cora Finch waiting 4 years, with a journal that wasn't hers to keep, but that she kept anyway, because keeping it was the only thing left to do. Then quietly, with the weight of someone who understood exactly what they were doing and why, Francis. A breath. Margaret. Neither man said anything. The names stood in the kitchen air, the way names stood, when they were the whole point, not the beginning of a sentence, not a preamble to something else, just themselves, taking up the space they deserved. Fletcher folded the letter, set it on the table, said he'd let himself out, which was exactly the right instinct. She heard his horse leave the yard, and then the kitchen was quiet with October light coming through the window at the low angle of the season. She'd known this was a possible outcome. Men like Holt moved through the world with the assurance of people who believed consequence was something that happened to other people, and sometimes they were right about that, and sometimes they found out otherwise. She didn't know what had happened at the bottom of those stairs on a Tuesday morning. She was honest enough with herself to understand that she didn't need to know, and that not needing to know was itself a kind of answer about where she stood. What she knew was that it had ended. The particular shape of the threat that had followed her from Georgia to Texas to this kitchen in Broken Spur was finished. What she hadn't anticipated was how complicated finished would feel. She'd expected clean relief, the kind that came when the door finally closed all the way, and relief was there, solid and real, and she wasn't going to perform otherwise for anyone's benefit. But underneath it, or woven through it in a way that made it impossible to separate out, was something heavier and less comfortable. Grief she hadn't expected to feel for women she'd never met. The grinding unfairness that Francis and Margaret had not made it to Thursday mornings, in kitchens where the news arrived and the word was over. They hadn't gotten to sit anywhere and breathe the air of a life that was actually theirs. They had gone to the bottom of staircases in that house, and they had never found out that something like justice eventually arrived in the same building. That sat on her chest in a way she needed to let sit before she could speak to it. "I don't feel what I thought I'd feel," she said. Cal looked at her from across the table. "What did you think you'd feel? Cleaner than this." She looked at her hands on the wood surface. "I thought the threat being gone would be the whole thing. Simple. Done. It's rarely the whole thing. No." A pause. "I got out and they didn't. I've said their names and someone who loved them sent their words to me, and I'm sitting here and they're not." She said it plainly because it was the plain truth, and she was done treating plain truths like they needed softening before she could speak them out loud. That doesn't go away just because Holt is gone. Cal was quiet for a moment. Then, "You said their names before you knew there was anyone left to hear it. Before you knew Cora existed. Before you knew about the journal." He held her gaze across the table. "You said them because they deserve to be said. That's not nothing. That's not a small thing. It doesn't fix it. No. But you did it anyway. And Cora heard, and Margaret's words got here." He looked at her steadily. "The record exists because you said their names in that yard." She sat with that until it settled into something she could carry, rather than something that was carrying her. The distinction mattered more than she could have explained before Texas. Before this kitchen and this man and this life, she'd been building one decision at a time. That afternoon, Mae went out to the garden. She dug the iris bulbs from where Ada had planted them along the south fence, working carefully, loosening the soil around each one before lifting it, treating them the way you treated things that had survived underground through seasons they didn't choose. She moved them to the north end of the garden, to a section she cleared with particular attention. She worked the soil deeper than she needed to, added ash from the kitchen stove, the way George Mabry's wife had mentioned in passing one morning, when Mae had asked about the clay composition. She worked until the light started going. Cal came out and helped with the last of it. Neither of them said much. The work was saying the thing that needed saying, and they both understood that. When it was done, she stood and looked at the turned earth in the last of the October light. She didn't say anything. She crouched down and pressed both palms flat against the soil. Not the table-steadying gesture of someone trying to anchor herself, but something different. Something deliberate. The way you placed your hands on ground, you'd prepared for something you intended to come back. She stayed like that for a moment. Then she stood and went inside and washed her hands and sat down at the kitchen table and wrote the letter to Cora Finch. She wrote it while Cal read in the armchair. She told Cora that Margaret's journal had reached someone who understood what it was. That a copy was now in the hands of a justice of the peace in Texas, who had connections beyond his county line. That she had read the journal completely, every page, every entry, the last 3 sentences 11 days before the end, and that Margaret had been extraordinary, clear-eyed and methodical and brave in the most unglamorous way, the way that required doing the hard thing alone in the dark, with no guarantee that it would ever matter to anyone. She told Cora she had moved iris bulbs to a new section of the garden, an older variety that came back on its own every spring without being asked. She said they were planted for Francis and Margaret both. She said they would come back whether anyone specifically remembered to tend them or not, because she had wanted the remembering to be built into the thing itself. She signed it Mae Reavis, addressed it to the boarding house in Georgia, sealed it before the cautious part of her brain could revise it into something more careful, because caution was sometimes just fear that had learned to dress better. "Done," she said. Cal looked up from his book. She held up the letter. "Good." He went back to reading. She looked at the sealed envelope and thought about how long Margaret had waited in the dark for someone to receive what she was sending, and how Cora had waited 4 years for the right moment and the right hands, and how Dorothea Wills had been standing on a porch at 4 in the morning in Georgia, with a bag already prepared, because some people spent their entire lives quietly building the conditions that made it possible for other people to get out, not for recognition, not for thanks that arrived in time, just because the work needed doing, and they were there to do it. Mae owed her actual life to women like that. The only way to repay it was to live the life properly, loudly enough, taking up the space she'd been told she didn't deserve. Winter came to the Texas Panhandle with the serious, steady cold of a place that had other priorities besides drama. Not theatrical, just committed, demanding the same commitment in return from anyone trying to live in it. she found she had it. She'd had it before Texas, but had been pointing it in the wrong direction, all that capacity for endurance aimed at surviving rather than building. Now it was aimed correctly, and the difference was considerable. She and Cal worked closer together in winter by necessity. More time in the barn where the animals' warmth made the cold bearable. They developed an efficiency with each other that didn't require language to function, the kind that grew between two people who had shared a kitchen and a fence line, and a confrontation, in a yard, and several evenings of lamplight copying and one winter of learning each other's rhythms, without making a project of it. One evening she noticed the burn scar on his right hand differently. She'd been aware of it since August, but winter light caught it in a way the sun-darkened skin of summer had softened. Pale against pale. "What is this from?" She took his hand to look, not asking permission. The kind of thing you did when you'd stopped calculating whether you were allowed to. Barn fire, Wyoming. He turned his hand so she could see the full extent of the scar. "I was 12. Went in for the horses. Did you get them out?" 2 of 3. He looked at the scar the way he looked at things he'd made peace with. Couldn't reach the 3rd. She understood the shape of that without needing it translated. What you could save, and what you couldn't reach in time. And the way you carried the one you couldn't reach, alongside the ones you did not as failure exactly, but as a permanent fact about the world that you'd learned too young, and couldn't unknow no matter how many years went past. She kept his hand. He turned it and held hers instead. Neither of them said anything about it. She didn't let go first. He didn't either. Outside the wind moved through the yard and the cottonwood answered it, and the lamp on the table made the kitchen warm in the literal sense of the word. Spring arrived on the panhandle in a single decision, not gradually, not with warnings. The grass went from gold to green the way Abador opened the way. Certain things that had been working their way toward them for a long time finally arrived all at once and became what they'd been becoming. Mae stepped outside one morning in late March and the air was different in every direction, and the irises came up, in the north section of the garden, where she'd planted the bulbs in October. The green shoots had been working their way upwards since the first warm week, and now the blooms opened, purple, with yellow hearts. Old variety, the kind that had been growing in someone's garden long enough that nobody remembered the exact beginning. They bloomed for 2 weeks, with the straightforward abundance of something that had been waiting underground all winter for precisely this moment, and had not had any doubts about whether the moment would come. Mae stood looking at them in the early morning on the day they opened and felt the specific fullness of a thing completed. Not ended, completed. The distinction she'd been learning all year. Ended things left nothing behind. Completed things left something forward, something that kept going without you having to push it every step. She'd kept the record alive. She'd planted the bulbs. She'd written the letter. Francis and Margaret were not forgotten by at least one person in Broken Spur, Texas, and that person would say their names to anyone who would listen, and would keep saying them, because that was how the record stayed alive. Person to person, name to name, season returning to season. The second ceremony was on a Saturday in May. Stagg arrived with the same Bible he'd used in August, and the warmth of a man doing something a second time, with complete understanding of why the second time was categorically different from the first. George Mabry brought his wife, who had become over the winter someone Mae considered a genuine friend, a woman with strong opinions about alkaline soil and about most other things, which Mae had come to appreciate more than she'd have predicted when they'd first met over the store counter. Fletcher Cord came. The Granger family from the neighboring ranch came with the easy familiarity of people who had decided they were part of this operation and had no interest in being argued otherwise. Mae wore the blue cotton dress, the one she'd bought with her own money at a dry goods store in Georgia during the journey west, the one she'd put on the morning of the first ceremony and thought, "This is what I look like when I'm choosing something." She wanted continuity with that woman, with that morning, with the version of herself who had stood at the kitchen table and proposed a marriage as a legal strategy, and meant every word of it for reasons that went far beyond strategy. Cal wore a white shirt slightly faded with age, genuinely his, not purchased for the occasion. She was glad it was the real one. Under the cottonwood in May light, with the grass green and the irises spent for this season's, but having done their work and left their stalks still standing in the north section of the garden, She said what she'd written over several evenings and rewritten because the first version was too careful. And she was done being careful when she meant to be direct. You put a lock on my door before you knew anything about me, except that I might need one. And that told me everything I needed to know about the kind of person I was trusting. She held his gaze without looking away, which had gotten easier across the months, without her marking the exact moment the difficulty left. You have been exactly that person every day since. I don't know what comes next, and I've made my peace with not knowing. Because not knowing is part of being alive rather than a problem to manage around. I choose you not because you're safe though you are, but because you're honest. And I've learned that those two things in a person don't always arrive together. When they do, it's worth saying out loud. Cal looked at her through all of it without looking away. When it was his turn, he was quiet for a moment, in the working way finding the right order, not withholding. I spent 3 years learning the dimensions of a house that felt too large for one person. A pause, deliberate. You came with 11 days of road dust on you, and a key you kept under your pillow for 2 weeks, and you made every room feel proportionate again. I wrote those letters looking for company. He held her gaze. I found something I didn't have a word for yet. I have the word now. Stagg said the words that made it official for the second and final time. Someone in the gathered group started a fiddle, and the yard shifted into the kind of morning a community had been waiting for an occasion to have. George Mabry's wife was explaining something about soil drainage to one of the Granger boys with the focused enthusiasm of someone who had found a willing audience and was not about to waste the opportunity. Fletcher had located a plate of food and was devoted to it with professional commitment. And Flint, the paint gelding, had come to the corral fence of his own accord. He was standing there with his ears tipped forward, watching the proceedings with the alert attention of an animal who found this considerably more interesting than anything that had been happening on his side of the rails all morning. Flint came out, Mae said. Cal glanced back. He's judging. He came anyway. She looked at Flint at the fence with his ears forward and his eye on the fiddle player. That's enough. Showing up is enough. She danced with Cal under the cottonwood, both of them aware they were not skilled dancers and equally indifferent to this fact. The fiddle played something that the Granger children knew the words to, and the afternoon moved the way afternoons moved, when something had been settled, not fast, not slow, just at the pace of things that didn't need to rush because they were already where they were going. Later, after the celebration dispersed and the last wagon had gone down the west road, and the yard had settled back into its own sounds, Mae and Cal sat on the porch steps in the last of the afternoon light. Close. The kind of close that had stopped requiring any conscious decision sometime during the winter. She leaned against his shoulder. He didn't say anything. She didn't either, for a while. The sky was doing its thing, spending everything it had, refusing to do it quietly. The kind of sunset that made the flatness feel less like a verdict, and more like a canvas that had been given exactly the right amount of space. The ranch settled into its end-of-day sounds. The cottonwood moved overhead, leaves catching the final light and holding it for a breath before letting it go. She thought about Dorothea Wills on a porch in Georgia at 4 a.m. with a bag already prepared. About Cora Finch keeping a dead woman's journal in a boarding house for 4 years, waiting for the right moment and the right pair of hands. About Margaret writing in the dark with the methodical calm of someone who had decided that the work was worth doing, even if no one ever received it. About all the women who had done the unglamorous, unwitnessed labor of building paths that someone else got to walk, who had done it without recognition, without thanks that arrived in time, without any guarantee that it would matter. Mae was someone else. She was the one who'd gotten to walk the path they built. And she was going to live loudly enough to honor that, not performatively loud, not the kind of loud that was really just noise trying to be mistaken for substance, the kind of loud that meant showing up, saying names, planting things that came back on their own, writing letters every spring to confirm that what had been planted was still growing, standing in yards, telling the truth to people who weren't expecting it. The kind of loud that was just a life, lived without apology, which turned out to be the loudest thing a person could be. Cal, she said. He looked at her. I'm going to write to Cora when the irises bloom next year. Just to tell her they came up again. They're still here. He looked at the north section of the garden where the spent stalks were still standing, green against the early evening. She'll want to know that. Every year, Mae said. Every spring when they bloom. Just that. It happened again. He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was actually considering it rather than just agreeing. Then, that's a good letter to write every year. She looked at her hands, the ring on her finger, the engraved leaf pattern worn smooth by her mother's years before it came to her. The calluses that had built up over the months, real ones, earned by work she'd chosen, rather than work that had been assigned to her by circumstances she hadn't controlled. Her hands looked like the hands of someone who had made something, who was still making something. Because she was. She leaned a little more into Cal's shoulder. He didn't shift away. Outside, Flint had left the fence and was standing in the last of the sun in the center of the corral on principle. As always, for reasons that would never fully be explained, but his ears were relaxed for once, tipped sideways rather than forward, the posture of an animal that had decided, provisionally, that today was acceptable. It was an early Tuesday morning in the last heat of summer when Mae sat across from Cal at the kitchen table and told him what she'd known for a week. The coffee between them had gone cold while she found the right way to say it, which turned out to be the plain way, the direct way, the way she'd learned to say the things that mattered since she'd arrived in Broken Spur with 11 days of road dust and a key she'd kept under her pillow. Cal went still. Not the calculating stillness. Not the stillness of a man working through a problem. The stillness of someone receiving something they had hoped for without letting themselves count on it, and finding that it had arrived anyway. He looked out the kitchen window at the yard, at the cottonwood already moving in the morning heat, at the garden where Ada's seeds had come up and where the irises had already done their spring work and were resting now until next year, at the corral where Flint was standing in the full morning sun because that was simply who Flint was and who Flint was going to remain, regardless of whatever else changed around him. Then Cal looked back at Mae, and she read it all on his face. Every word of it, clearer than the 3 letters that had brought her here. Clearer than anything she'd known in the year before she got on the coach in Georgia and pointed herself toward the unknown on the strength of 3 letters. And a conviction that whatever she was running toward had to be better than what she was leaving. She'd been right about that. She'd been right about all of it. Outside, the cottonwood held the morning light in its leaves the way it always did, briefly, without grasping, and then let it move on, the way living things held and released, not because they had to, because that was what being alive asked of them, season after season after season. She was equal to it. She had been for some time now. It had just taken getting here to find that out.